direct transmission, not relying on words. Zen emphasizes that truth cannot be fully captured by language or scriptures. 2,500 years ago, on a mountaintop in ancient India, the most respected spiritual teacher in the world stood before an audience of thousands and said absolutely nothing, not a single word. The Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, the man whose spoken teachings would eventually fill entire libraries, whose every utterance had been memorized and debated and dissected for decades, simply reached down, picked up a flower, and held it in the air. That was it. That was the whole sermon. The crowd was baffled. Monks who had memorized volumes of scripture sat frozen, confused, searching their encyclopedic knowledge of Buddhist doctrine for some frame of reference, some precedent for what they were witnessing. Was he ill? Had he forgotten his notes? Was this some kind of test? But one person in that crowd understood. An old monk named Mahakasyapa, sitting somewhere in the assembly, looked at the Buddha holding that flower, and he smiled, just a quiet, gentle, knowing smile. And the Buddha, seeing that smile, spoke for the first and only time during that gathering. He said, roughly translated, "I possess the true Dharma I, the marvelous mind of nirvana, the true form of the formless, the subtle Dharma gate that does not rest on words or letters, but is a special transmission outside of the scriptures. This I entrust to Mahakasyapa." With those words, according to Zen tradition, something extraordinary happened. Not a philosophy, not a doctrine, not even a teaching in the conventional sense. What passed between the Buddha and Mahakasyapa in that silent moment was the essence of awakening itself, transmitted directly from one awakened mind to another, without any mediating concept, text, or explanation. This moment, known as the Flower Sermon, is considered by many to be the origin story of Zen Buddhism, and it encapsulates the single most radical and countercultural idea in all of Buddhist history, that the deepest truth about reality cannot be captured in language. Think about how strange that is. We live in a world absolutely saturated with words. We text, we email, we write reports, we read articles, we listen to podcasts, we scroll through endless feeds of information. We have more words available to us at any given second than any civilization in human history. We assume, almost without thinking about it, that if something is real, it can be described. If something is true, it can be articulated. If something is important, it can be written down. And along comes Zen, quietly and stubbornly insisting that the most important truth of all, the thing that would actually liberate you from suffering, the direct experience of your own awakened nature, is something that language can never quite reach, not because language is bad, not because words are evil, but because the experience of reality is so immediate, so total, so alive, that the moment you wrap it in a concept, you have already stepped one step away from it. You are holding a menu instead of eating the meal. You are studying a map instead of walking the territory. This is the story of that idea. Not just the Flower Sermon, but the entire sprawling, beautiful, sometimes fierce, sometimes funny, occasionally bewildering tradition that grew from that single moment of shared silence on a mountaintop. This is the story of direct transmission, the living heart of Zen Buddhism. And it stretches across 2,500 years, from ancient India through medieval China to modern-day meditation halls scattered across the globe. Along the way, we will meet monks who cut off their own arms to prove their sincerity, illiterate woodcutters, who became the greatest spiritual teachers of their era, fierce masters, who answered profound philosophical questions with a smack or a shout, and quiet practitioners who found the deepest truth of the universe in a cup of tea or the sound of a stone hitting bamboo. We will explore the paradox at the center of Zen, which is that it has produced one of the richest literary traditions in all of Buddhism, while simultaneously insisting that words can never fully capture what it is pointing toward. And we will discover that this ancient idea, this insistence on direct experience over secondhand knowledge, may be more relevant to our overstimulated, information-saturated modern lives than it has ever been. So settle in, let your breathing slow. Let the words wash over you the way water moves over river stones. Because ironically, we are about to spend a long time using words to explore the limits of words, using language to point toward what lies just beyond language. And if somewhere in the middle of this journey, something in you relaxes, something in you recognizes a truth that you have always known, but could never quite name, well, that is the whole point. Let us begin with 4 lines that changed the course of spiritual history. There is a stanza in Zen Buddhism that functions almost like a creed, though Zen would resist that comparison fiercely. 4 lines attributed to the legendary Indian monk Bodhidharma have been memorized, chanted, debated, celebrated, and occasionally challenged for over 1,000 years. In their most common English rendering, they read something like this: a special transmission outside the scriptures, not founded upon words and letters. By pointing directly to one's mind, it lets one see into one's own true nature, and thus attain Buddhahood. These 4 lines are arguably the most compressed and powerful mission statement in the history of religion. In just a handful of words, they lay out the entire philosophical and practical foundation of Zen. Let us take them apart, one by one, because each line contains an ocean of meaning, a special transmission outside the scriptures. This first line is the most provocative. By the time this stanza gained wide circulation in Chinese Buddhism, probably sometime around the 10th or 11th century, Buddhist culture had already developed an enormous body of sacred texts. The Pali Canon alone, which preserves the earliest Buddhist teachings, runs to thousands of pages. The Mahayana tradition had added countless more sutras, each with their own elaborate commentaries and sub-commentaries. Buddhist monasteries in China were centers of learning, where monks spent their entire lives studying, copying, translating, and interpreting these vast collections of scripture. And then along comes this bold declaration: there exists a transmission of Buddhist truth that operates outside of all of that. Not in opposition to it, necessarily, but independent of it. The scriptures, this stanza is saying, are valuable guides, like signposts on a road. But the destination they point toward can only be reached through a kind of knowing that no text can contain. This was and remains a radical statement. It does not say that the scriptures are wrong. It does not say that study is worthless. Centuries of Zen teachers have been careful to clarify this point. What it says is that the ultimate truth of Buddhism, the direct experience of awakening, cannot be adequately captured or communicated through written or spoken language. The scriptures can point. They can inspire. They can provide a framework and a vocabulary. But they cannot, by themselves, deliver the experience any more than reading a cookbook can satisfy your hunger. Not founded upon words and letters. The second line deepens the first. It is not just that the transmission happens to exist outside the scriptures. It is that its very nature is non-linguistic. This is crucial. The claim here is not merely practical, like saying you cannot learn to swim from a book. It is philosophical. The nature of awakened reality, what Zen calls your original face, or your Buddha nature, is something that exists prior to and independent of conceptual thought. Words and letters are tools of discrimination. They work by dividing the seamless fabric of experience into categories. This and that, hot and cold, self and other, good and bad. But the awakened state, according to Zen, is precisely the recognition that reality is not ultimately divided in these ways. It is whole. It is non-dual. And so any attempt to capture it in dualistic language inevitably distorts it. The way trying to capture running water in a net always leaves you with something less than the living stream. This does not mean that Zen rejects language altogether. That is a common misunderstanding. Zen has produced an astonishingly rich literary tradition, from the vast koan collections to the lyrical poetry of its greatest masters, from Dogen's dense philosophical masterwork, the Shabogen's, to the simple calligraphy of an Enso circle brushed on paper. What Zen rejects is the confusion of the pointing finger with the moon it points toward. Use language, Zen says. Use it skillfully, even beautifully. But never mistake it for the thing itself by pointing directly to one's mind. Here is the positive content of the teaching. If words cannot deliver the ultimate truth, what can? The answer is startling in its simplicity. Direct pointing. One mind pointing directly at another mind. One awakened being meeting another being at the level of raw, unmediated experience. This is the heart of the teacher-student relationship in Zen. The teacher does not explain enlightenment. The teacher does not give the student a set of propositions to believe. The teacher, through whatever means are appropriate, whether it is a gesture, a word, a shout, a silence, a slap, or a held-up flower, points directly at the student's own mind, directing their attention away from concepts and back toward the living, breathing, present moment awareness that is their birthright, seeing into one's own true nature, and thus attaining Buddhahood. And here is the promise. When the pointing works, when the student's attention turns inward in the right way, and they see, really see, the nature of their own mind, they discover something that has been there all along. They discover that their true nature is not separate from the nature of the Buddha. They discover that they have always been, fundamentally, what they were seeking to become. This is not a new acquisition. It is a recognition. It is like a person who has been frantically searching their house for their glasses, only to realize they have been wearing them the whole time. Now, historically, there is an important complication worth acknowledging. Modern scholars have pointed out that these 4 lines were probably not actually composed by Bodhidharma himself. The earliest documented appearance of the full stanza dates to the Anthology of the Patriarchal Hall, compiled in 952. Several centuries after Bodhidharma's death, the scholar Albert Welter has argued that the idea of Zen as a special transmission outside the scriptures was a post-Tang innovation, one that was actually contested within the Chan community itself. Some early Chan teachers, particularly in the Huayu region, accepted Bodhidharma's warning against attachment to scriptures, but did not accept that this amounted to a complete rejection of scriptural authority. The phrase gained its current prominence partly through institutional politics. As the Linji, or Rinzai, lineage successfully argued during the Song dynasty for official recognition of Chan as an independent mystical tradition, rather than simply another school of scriptural Buddhism. This historical context does not diminish the power of the teaching. If anything, it enriches it. It shows that the idea of direct transmission was not a static doctrine handed down unchanged, but a living insight that the tradition itself had to struggle with, debate, and gradually articulate. The tension between words and the wordless, between scripture and experience, between tradition and direct insight, is not a problem that Zen solved once and put away. It is the creative tension that has powered the tradition for over 1,000 years. And it all goes back, at least in Zen's own telling, to that mountain in India, that assembled crowd, that single held-up flower, and that quiet, knowing smile. To understand how the idea of direct transmission took root and flourished, we need to look at the soil it was planted in. The notion that ultimate reality transcends language did not spring fully formed from the head of Zen. It grew from deep roots in both Indian Buddhism and Chinese philosophy, drawing nourishment from traditions that had been wrestling with the relationship between words and truth for centuries before Bodhidharma ever set foot in China. Start with the Buddha himself. Long before the flower sermon, which modern scholars regard as a later Chinese invention rather than a historical event, the historical Buddha had already established a nuanced and sometimes skeptical relationship with language. In the Pali Canon, the earliest surviving collection of Buddhist teachings, the Buddha frequently warns against becoming attached to views and opinions. He uses the famous parable of the raft. His teachings are like a raft that carries you across a river. But once you have reached the other shore, you do not keep carrying the raft on your back. The teachings are useful, even essential, but they are tools, not destinations. The Buddha also employed what scholars call skillful means, adjusting his teaching to the capacity and needs of his audience. He did not have a single fixed doctrine to transmit. He had an awakened perspective from which he could respond freshly and appropriately to each situation. There is already something in this that anticipates Zen, the sense that truth is alive, contextual, and relational rather than fixed, formulaic, and textual. The Mahayana Buddhist tradition, which developed several centuries after the Buddha's death and provided the philosophical foundation for Zen, deepened this suspicion of language considerably. The great philosopher Nagarjuna, who lived around the 2nd century of the Common Era, developed a rigorous philosophical method that demonstrated the emptiness of all concepts, including Buddhist concepts themselves. Nagarjuna showed that every proposition, when pushed to its logical extreme, collapses into contradiction. This was not nihilism. It was a philosophical practice designed to loosen the grip of conceptual thinking and open the mind to a direct encounter with reality that no concept could contain. The Prajnaparamita literature, which includes the famous Heart Sutra with its startling declaration that form is emptiness. Emptiness is form, pushes language to its breaking point, using paradox and negation to gesture toward a reality that language can only circle around but never land on. These are not accidental precursors to Zen. They are its direct philosophical ancestors. Then there is the Vimalakirti Sutra, a Mahayana text that was enormously popular in China and deeply influential on Chan Buddhism. In this sutra, the layman Vimalakirti is asked to explain the nature of non-duality. He is asked to describe, in words, the state beyond all distinctions, and his response is a thundering silence. He simply says nothing. The assembled bodhisattvas recognize this silence as the most eloquent teaching on the subject. If you want to talk about what lies beyond all talk, the most honest thing you can do is stop talking. This story, centuries older than Chan, already contains the entire logic of direct transmission. When Buddhism entered China, beginning around the 1st century of the Common Era, it encountered a culture that had its own rich tradition of thinking about the limits of language. Chinese Taoism, particularly as expressed in the Tao Te Ching attributed to Laozi, opens with one of the most famous lines in all of philosophy. The way that can be spoken of is not the constant way. The very first sentence of the founding text of Taoism is a warning that language cannot capture ultimate reality. Laozi goes on to say that names and definitions are always partial and provisional, that the deepest truths show themselves not through assertion, but through a kind of yielding, open receptivity that he calls wu wei, or non-action. The Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi, writing a few centuries later, developed this idea further, producing a body of work so playful, paradoxical, and suspicious of fixed positions that it reads at times almost like early Chan literature. This is not to say that Chan or Zen Buddhism is simply Taoism in disguise. The relationship is more subtle than that. When Indian Buddhism arrived in China, Chinese translators initially used Taoist vocabulary to render Buddhist concepts. The Sanskrit word dharma was sometimes translated using the Chinese character Tao. Buddhist emptiness was explained through the Taoist lens of non-being. This practice, known as concept matching, created a certain degree of mutual influence and occasional confusion. But the important point is that when Chan teachers later insisted that truth transcends words, they were speaking to an audience that already had a cultural intuition for this idea. The ground had been prepared. A Chinese audience hearing the claim that the finger pointing to the moon is not the moon would not have found this entirely alien. It resonated with something they had absorbed from their own philosophical heritage. There is one more crucial thread to weave in here: the Lankavatara Sutra, a complex Mahayana text that was closely associated with early Chan. Bodhidharma himself is said to have given a copy to his successor Huig, telling him that this sutra alone would guide him. The Lankavatara is, among other things, a sustained meditation on the relationship between language and reality. It argues that all words and concepts are projections of the discriminating mind, that they create the appearance of a divided world where there are subjects and objects, selves and others, when the actual nature of reality is undivided consciousness. The text explicitly warns that clinging to language and conceptual frameworks blinds us to ultimate truth. As the sutra puts it, in imagery that would become central to Zen, as the ignorant grasp the fingertip and do not cognize the moon, so those who cling to the letter do not know my truth. So when we arrive at the story of Bodhidharma carrying Zen from India to China, we should understand that he did not arrive in an empty field. He arrived in a rich, sophisticated cultural environment that had been thinking about these questions for centuries. What Bodhidharma brought, according to the tradition, was not an idea, but an embodiment. He did not just talk about the limits of language. He lived with them. And it is to his story, part history and part legend, that we turn next. Sometime in the late 5th or early 6th century, a monk from the western regions, possibly South India, possibly Central Asia, arrived in China. His name was Bodhidharma, and he would become, in the centuries that followed, one of the most iconic figures in all of Asian religious history, depicted in thousands of paintings and sculptures as a fierce, bushy-browed, wide-eyed figure whose very appearance seemed to challenge you to drop your pretensions and face reality head-on. Very little can be verified about Bodhidharma's actual life. The earliest mention of him appears in a text from around 547, the record of the Buddhist monasteries of Luoyang, where a monk from the western regions named Bodhidharma is described admiring the golden discs atop a monastery stupa, claiming to be 150 years old, and declaring that in all his travels through many countries, he had never seen anything like it. It is a brief, colorful passage, and it tells us almost nothing about the spiritual revolutionary that later tradition would make him into. The biographical details that have come down through the centuries are a mixture of historical possibility and elaborate legend. According to the most widely told version, Bodhidharma traveled to southern China and was granted an audience with Emperor Wu of the Liang dynasty. Emperor Wu was one of the most devout Buddhist rulers in Chinese history. He had built temples, supported monasteries, commissioned translations of sutras, and spent enormous resources promoting Buddhism throughout his kingdom. Naturally, when this famous monk from India appeared at his court, the emperor expected validation. "I have built many temples," the emperor said, or words to that effect. "I have supported countless monks. I have done great works for Buddhism. What merit have I accumulated?" Bodhidharma's answer was blunt: "No merit whatsoever." The emperor, confused and perhaps offended, tried again. "What then is the highest truth of the sacred teaching?" "Vast emptiness," Bodhidharma replied. "Nothing sacred." Growing frustrated, the emperor demanded, "Who is this standing before me?" "I do not know," said Bodhidharma. This exchange, which appears as the first case in the famous Blue Cliff Record koan collection, is a perfect condensation of everything direct transmission is about. Here is a monk who refuses to validate conventional religious accomplishment, who insists that truth is not something you can accumulate through good deeds or temple building, who points relentlessly beyond conceptual categories, even the category of sacred, and who, when asked the most fundamental question of identity, responds with a radical unknowing: "I do not know." Not because he is confused, but because the self that we think we are, the fixed entity that we imagine stands behind our thoughts and actions, is exactly the illusion that Zen practice is designed to dissolve. Unsatisfied, Emperor Wu dismissed Bodhidharma, or perhaps Bodhidharma simply left on his own. Either way, the monk traveled north, crossing the Yangtze River, and eventually settled in a cave near the Shaolin Monastery on Mount Song, in what is now Henan Province. And there, according to legend, he sat facing the wall in meditation for 9 years. 9 years. Think about that for a moment. The story says he simply sat, day after day, year after year, facing a blank wall. He became known as the wall-gazing Brahmin. Legend adds colorful embellishments, that he sat so still his legs eventually withered away, which is why traditional Daruma dolls in Japan are round and legless, that he once fell asleep during meditation and was so furious with himself that he tore off his own eyelids, and where they fell, tea plants sprouted, forever linking tea with Zen practice. These are folk legends, not history, but they communicate something true about the intensity and single-mindedness that Zen practice demands. Historically, Bodhidharma's wall-gazing was more than just sitting and staring. The earliest text that can be attributed to him, the 2 entrances and 4 practices, describes 2 paths to awakening. The first is the entrance through principle, which involves awakening to the realization that all beings are identical to the true nature. If one abides in wall-examining without being swayed by the scriptures, one will tally with principle. The term wall-examining has been the subject of endless interpretation. Some take it literally, sitting cross-legged facing a wall, as Soto Zen practitioners still do today. Others read it metaphorically, making the mind as steady and immovable as a wall, so that no external teaching or internal distraction can penetrate it. Still others suggest it means gazing at one's own mind the way one gazes at a wall, simply looking without judgment, analysis, or expectation. Whatever the precise meaning, the practice was revolutionary. Here was a Buddhist teacher who was saying that the path to awakening did not depend on elaborate rituals, exhaustive study of sutras, or the accumulation of religious merit. It depended on sitting still and looking directly at the nature of the mind itself. The practice was radically simple, demanding not vast knowledge, but vast patience, not intellectual brilliance, but unwavering attention. It was a practice that any person could undertake, regardless of their education or social status, because the object of investigation, one's own mind, was something everyone already possessed. But it was not easy. It was, in fact, almost unbearably difficult. Not because the technique was complicated, but precisely because it was simple. When you sit facing a blank wall with nothing to distract you, no book to read, no prayer to recite, no ritual to perform, you come face to face with the full force of your own mental chaos. Thoughts race, memories surface, anxieties multiply. The ego, deprived of its usual entertainment, goes into what can only be described as a kind of tantrum. This is what the Zen tradition means when it says that the wall is not really external. The wall is internal. It is the wall of your own habitual thinking, your own compulsive patterns of grasping and aversion, your own deeply ingrained sense of being a separate self in a hostile world. And the practice is to sit with that wall patiently, without fleeing from it or trying to knock it down, until something shifts, until you see through it, until you discover that the wall was never as solid as it seemed. Bodhidharma sat with that wall for 9 years, becoming a living demonstration of his own teaching. He did not write books. He did not build institutions. He did not seek followers. He sat, and eventually, the tradition tells us, someone came who was desperate enough, sincere enough, and stubborn enough to match Bodhidharma's own legendary intensity. That person would become the second patriarch of Chinese Zen, and his story is one of the most dramatic in the entire tradition. His name was Shengguang, later renamed Huig, and he was already a formidable scholar when he came to Bodhidharma's cave. He had studied Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism extensively. By some accounts, he was already considered enlightened by certain Buddhist teachers. But something in him was not at peace. Something in him knew that all his learning, all his accomplishments, all his intellectual mastery of Buddhist doctrine had not resolved the fundamental restlessness of his mind. He was like a person who owns a library full of cookbooks, but is still starving. According to the most famous version of the story, Huig came to Bodhidharma's cave on a cold winter day and asked to be accepted as a student. Bodhidharma ignored him. Huig stood outside in the falling snow, waiting. Hours passed. The snow piled up around his legs. Still, Bodhidharma sat facing the wall, silent, unmoved. In some stories, Huig stood there all night. Finally, in a gesture of absolute desperation and commitment, Huig cut off his own left arm and presented it to Bodhidharma. Modern readers often struggle with this part of the story. The self-mutilation seems extreme, even disturbing. And it should be said that many contemporary Zen teachers handle this episode carefully, noting that it functions within the tradition as a symbolic teaching about the depth of commitment required for genuine awakening, not as a literal model for student behavior. The arm cutting represents the willingness to let go of everything you think you are, everything you cling to, including your own body, in pursuit of truth. It is the same impulse that drove Siddhartha Gautama to leave his palace, his family, and his princely life. Some scholars also suggest the story may have been embellished over time, and that the historical Huig may have lost his arm through other means. But within the tradition, the story serves a powerful purpose. It communicates the urgency, the near madness, the absolute seriousness that Zen regards as necessary for breaking through the barriers of conventional mind. Bodhidharma, seeing the severed arm, finally turned to Huig and asked, "What do you seek?" Huig said, "My mind is not at peace. Master, please pacify it." And here is where the entire teaching of direct transmission comes alive in a single exchange. Bodhidharma did not offer Huig a meditation technique. He did not prescribe a sutra to study. He did not give him a mantra to recite. He did not explain the nature of mind through philosophical discourse. Instead, he said something so simple, so immediate, and so devastating that it cut through centuries of accumulated Buddhist intellectualism like a blade. "Bring me your mind," Bodhidharma said, "and I will pacify it." Huig went away to search for his mind. He searched, presumably, the way a scholar searches, trying to locate this thing called mind that was causing him so much trouble. Where is this anxious mind? Where does it reside? What is it made of? Can it be found? Can it be grasped? Can it be held up for inspection? He came back to Bodhidharma and said, "I have searched for my mind, but I cannot find it." And Bodhidharma replied, "There, I have completely pacified your mind." In that instant, according to tradition, Huike was enlightened. This exchange became one of the most celebrated encounters in all of Zen history, appearing as Case 41 in the Gateless Gate, one of the foundational koan collections, and it is worth sitting with for a moment because it illustrates with perfect clarity what direct transmission actually looks like in practice. Notice what happened. Bodhidharma did not pacify Huike's mind. He did not give him anything. He did not fix anything. What he did was redirect Huike's attention. Instead of trying to solve the problem of the anxious mind by adding more concepts, more techniques, more spiritual accomplishments to it, Bodhidharma sent Huike to look at the mind itself. And when Huike looked, really looked, with the raw sincerity of a man who had just cut off his arm to prove he was serious, he could not find it. The mind that he thought was causing all his trouble, the solid, substantial, locatable entity that he called my mind, turned out to be unfindable, not because it does not exist in some sense, but because it does not exist in the solid, graspable, object-like way that we habitually imagine. And in that recognition, in that moment of genuinely not finding what he was looking for, the anxiety dissolved, not because it was suppressed or managed or medicated, but because the very foundation on which the anxiety was built, the assumption of a fixed, findable self that possesses a fixed, findable mind, was seen through. There was nothing to pacify because there was no solid entity suffering. There was just the open, flowing, ungraspable nature of awareness itself. This is direct transmission, not the transfer of information from one person to another, not a secret teaching whispered in the ear, but the moment when one person's skillful intervention causes another person to look in the right direction and see for themselves what was always already the case. Bodhidharma did not give Huike enlightenment. He helped Huike discover the enlightenment that was already his nature. The teacher does not create the moon. The teacher points, and if the student has eyes and is willing to look, they see the moon for themselves. After this exchange, Bodhidharma accepted Huike as his student and eventually transmitted the Dharma to him, making Huike the second patriarch of Chinese Chan. According to one tradition, when Bodhidharma was old and about to leave China or pass away, he gathered his 4 most accomplished students and asked each to express their understanding. 3 gave various verbal and nonverbal responses, but Huike simply stood, said nothing, bowed, and sat back down. Bodhidharma recognized in this silent bow the deepest understanding and formally named Huike as his successor. It was, fittingly, a transmission that happened without words. Bodhidharma also gave Huike a copy of the Lankavatara Sutra, that great Mahayana text on the nature of mind and the limits of language. There is a beautiful paradox in this. The master who insisted on a transmission outside the scriptures nevertheless handed his successor a scripture. But the paradox is only apparent. The sutra was not meant to replace the direct experience. It was meant to support it. It was a map to be used by someone who had already glimpsed the territory, a confirmation and elaboration of what Huike had already seen for himself in that unforgettable moment when he searched for his mind and could not find it. From Huike, the transmission passed to Senkan, the third patriarch, about whom very little is known except that he is credited with one of the most beautiful early Chan texts, the Xingxin Ming, or Faith in Mind. From Senkan, it passed to Daixin, the fourth patriarch, who began to establish more formal monastic communities. From Daixin, it passed to Hongren, the fifth patriarch, who presided over what was becoming a thriving and increasingly influential spiritual movement. And from Hongren, in one of the most dramatic stories in all of Zen history, it passed to an illiterate woodcutter from the far south of China, whose understanding of the Dharma would reshape the entire tradition. His name was Huineng, and his story reads like something out of a folk tale. Born around 638 in the far south of China, in what is now Guangdong province, Huineng came from poverty. His father, a low-ranking official, had been banished to the provinces and died when Huineng was young, leaving the boy and his mother in desperate circumstances. Huineng never learned to read or write. He earned a meager living selling firewood in the marketplace. One day, while delivering firewood to an inn, Huineng overheard a man reciting a passage from the Diamond Sutra, one of the foundational texts of Mahayana Buddhism. The line that pierced him was, "One should activate one's mind so it has no attachment." Hearing these words, according to the tradition, Huineng was suddenly and completely transformed. Something in that simple phrase bypassed all the gates that literacy and education are supposed to guard and struck directly at the core of his being. He asked the man about the sutra and learned that it came from the teaching of the fifth patriarch, Hongren, who lived at a monastery far to the north on East Mountain. Huineng made the arduous journey, traveling 500 miles through dangerous terrain to find Hongren. When he arrived and announced himself, Hongren tested him. "Where are you from? What do you seek?" "I am a commoner from the south," Huineng said. "I have come seeking nothing but Buddhahood." Hongren reportedly challenged him, noting his humble origins, but Huineng's response revealed a mind already awake to the most fundamental teachings of Buddhism. He said something to the effect of, "Although there are people from the north and the south, there is no north or south in Buddha nature." The fifth patriarch recognized immediately that this unlettered woodcutter possessed an extraordinary understanding and assigned him to work in the monastery kitchen, pounding rice. What happened next is one of the great set pieces of Zen literature. Hongren announced that he wished to select a successor and asked his students to compose a verse, or gatha, expressing their understanding of the Dharma. The senior monk, Shengxiu, was widely expected to be chosen. He wrote his verse on the monastery wall in the middle of the night. "The body is the tree of enlightenment. The mind is like a bright mirror stand. Time after time polish it diligently so that no dust can collect." It is a perfectly respectable Buddhist verse, expressing the gradual approach to practice. The mind is inherently pure, like a mirror, but through diligent effort, we must keep polishing away the dust of delusion that accumulates on it. Practice is ongoing maintenance. Enlightenment is something achieved through sustained effort over time. Huineng, who could not write, heard Shengxiu's verse being recited and asked a young monk to help him compose a response. The verse he dictated was, "Enlightenment is not a tree, The bright mirror has no stand. Originally, there is not one thing. What place could there be for dust? This verse strikes at the root of dualistic thinking. There is no mirror to polish, because there is no fixed, substantial mind-entity that can be separated from reality and cleaned up. There is no dust to remove, because delusion itself, when looked at directly, is found to be empty. The verse does not describe a method of practice. It describes the nature of reality itself. It is a declaration that awakening is not something you build through effort, but something you recognize when you stop assuming it is absent. The fifth patriarch recognized the depth of Huineng's understanding, but was cautious. According to the traditional account, Hongren came to Huineng secretly in the dead of night and explained the Diamond Sutra to him. When Huineng heard the phrase, "One should activate one's mind so it has no attachment," he was, as the text says, suddenly and completely enlightened, and understood that all things exist in self-nature. It was the same line that had first awakened him in the firewood market years before, but now, with the accumulated weight of his practice and the direct guidance of an awakened teacher, the understanding was total. Hongren transmitted the Dharma to Huineng that night, along with his robe and bowl, the physical symbols of the patriarchal succession. He also warned Huineng that his life might be in danger from jealous monks who expected the succession to go to Shangxiu. "Leave tonight," Hongren told him. "Go south. Hide. Do not teach for many years." The Dharma was transmitted from mind to mind, whereas the robe was passed down physically from one patriarch to the next. And so Huineng fled south, carrying the robe and bowl, pursued by monks who wanted to seize them. In one famous episode, a former military general named Huiming caught up with Huineng on a mountain pass. But when Huiming reached for the robe and bowl, he found he could not lift them. In that moment of failure, something shifted in him, and he asked Huineng for instruction. Huineng asked the question that would become one of the most famous koans in all of Zen, not thinking of good, not thinking of evil, just at this moment. What is your original face before your mother and father were born? Hearing this, Huiming was enlightened. The story of Huiming's encounter on the mountain pass echoes the earlier encounter between Bodhidharma and Huig, the second patriarch, who cut off his own arm to demonstrate his sincerity. Both stories center on the same essential dynamic. A person reaches the absolute limit of their ordinary resources, the point where willpower, intelligence, and physical strength have all been exhausted. And in that moment of total surrender, something opens. It is as if the universe has been waiting for exactly this moment. The moment when you finally stop trying to force your way through the door and realize that the door was never locked. The arm cutting is extreme, and as we discussed, likely symbolic rather than literal. But what it symbolizes is real. The willingness to sacrifice everything you think you are in order to discover what you actually are. In Zen, this is not metaphorical. It is the lived experience of countless practitioners who have sat on the cushion until their legs screamed and their backs ached and their minds roared with protest, and who kept sitting, not out of stubbornness, but out of a faith deeper than faith, a conviction that something real lies on the other side of this discomfort, if only they can stay present long enough to find it. Huineng eventually settled in the south, and after many years of living in obscurity, began teaching. His approach became the foundation for what is called the Southern School of Chan, which emphasized sudden enlightenment, the recognition that awakening is not something gradually assembled through practice, but something immediately available in this very moment. The Northern School, associated with Shengxiu, emphasized a more gradual approach. Over time, the Southern School prevailed, and Huineng came to be regarded as the sixth and final patriarch of Chan Buddhism, the common ancestor of every Zen lineage that exists today. The Platform Sutra, attributed to Huineng and considered the only Chinese Buddhist text to be honored with the title Sutra, preserves his central teachings. He declared that all people possess Buddha nature, and that one's nature is originally pure. Instead of reading scriptures, building temples, or reciting the Buddha's name, one should simply seek to discover one's own nature. The way to do this is through calm and wisdom, which arise naturally when the mind is freed from deliberate thought and attachment to things. If one sees one's own nature, enlightenment will follow suddenly, without external help. The story of Huineng is powerful on many levels. It is the story of a nobody, an illiterate commoner from the wrong part of the country, who proved that the deepest spiritual truth is not the property of the educated, the privileged, or the religiously certified. It is a story about the democracy of awakening. Anyone, at any time, in any circumstances, can see their true nature. And it is a story about the primacy of direct experience over textual knowledge. Huineng could not read the Diamond Sutra, but he understood it more deeply than monks who had spent their entire lives studying it. His understanding did not come from the words on the page. It came from the reality to which those words pointed, a reality he encountered directly, without mediation, in the simple hearing of a single sentence. This is direct transmission at its most vivid, a line from a sutra, heard by chance in a marketplace, striking an unlettered mind like a bell, and awakening something that had been sleeping. No teacher was present for that first awakening. No monastery, no ritual, no formal practice. Just words landing in soil that was, for reasons no one could explain, already prepared to receive them. After Huineng, Chan Buddhism entered what is often called its golden age. In the decades and centuries following the sixth patriarch's death around 713, the tradition exploded with creative energy. Huineng's students and their students spread across China, founding monasteries, attracting followers, and developing the distinctive styles of teaching that would eventually crystallize into the major schools of Zen. This was the era of the great Tang dynasty masters, whose names still echo through every Zen meditation hall in the world. Ma Zudai, whose startling shout could reportedly shake the walls, and who once told a student that this very mind is Buddha, and later, when the student had grown attached to that teaching, corrected himself by saying neither mind nor Buddha. Huangbo Xian, whose diamond cutter prose and devastating directness would later be compiled into a book that the scholar John Blofeld translated as the Zen teaching of Huang Po. One of the first Zen texts widely read in the West. Linji Yixuan, the fierce and uncompromising master whose school would bear his name across the centuries. And Jiezhu Kungshen, who lived to the remarkable age of 120, according to tradition, and whose gentle, paradoxical teachings would become some of the most beloved koans in the entire Zen literature. These masters did not sit in libraries composing treatises. They lived in rough mountain monasteries, farmed the land, cooked their own meals, and transmitted the Dharma through face-to-face encounters that crackled with spontaneity and danger. A student would approach with a sincere question and receive a shout, a slap, a nonsensical answer, or a profound silence. The encounters were recorded by students and later compiled into collections that became the raw material for the koan tradition. Each encounter was unique, unrepeatable, tailored to the specific student and the specific moment. And yet, across all their differences in style and temperament, these masters shared one common conviction: the truth they were pointing to could not be found in any book, any doctrine, any system of thought. It could only be found in the direct, unmediated encounter between mind and reality. In this moment, right here, right now, it is to the koan, the most ingenious tool these masters invented for provoking that encounter, that we now turn. And yet, this raises a question that sits at the very center of Zen's method. If truth cannot be conveyed in words, how do you teach it? If direct experience is all that matters, how do you help someone else arrive at that experience? You cannot hand them your awakening the way you hand someone a book. You cannot pour your understanding into their mind the way you pour water into a cup. So what do you do? The answer that Zen developed over the centuries is one of the most ingenious pedagogical inventions in the history of human spirituality. It is called the koan. The word koan comes from the Chinese gongen, which literally means public case or legal precedent, a term borrowed from the language of law and government. In its original Chinese context, a gongen was a case study, a record of a decision that subsequent judges could use as a guide. In Zen, the term was applied to recorded encounters between masters and students, brief episodes in which something essential was revealed, challenged, or transmitted. These encounters were compiled into collections, the most famous being the Gateless Gate, assembled by the Chinese Zen master Wumen Huikai in the early 13th century, and the Blue Cliff Record, compiled about a century earlier. Together, these two collections contain some of the most celebrated koans in the tradition. What is the sound of one hand clapping? Does a dog have Buddha nature? Mew. What was your original face before your mother and father were born? On the surface, koans look like nonsensical riddles, and many people who encounter them casually, in a book or a casual conversation, treat them that way, as cute paradoxes, conversation starters, philosophical brain teasers. But this completely misses their purpose. Koans are not puzzles to be solved. They are tools designed to shatter the mind's habitual patterns of conceptual thinking and force it into a mode of direct, non-conceptual awareness. Consider the most famous koan of all, Joshu's dog, which is case one of the Gateless Gate. A monk asked the Chinese master Zheju, who lived in the 9th century, "Does a dog have Buddha nature?" Now, in Buddhist doctrine, the answer is clear. All sentient beings possess Buddha nature. This is not a debatable point. It is a basic tenet of the Mahayana tradition. So the monk's question has an obvious doctrinal answer. Yes, but Zheju did not give the doctrinal answer. He said Mew. In Chinese and Japanese, Mew essentially means no or nothing, or without. But it is not a simple negation. It is, as generations of Zen teachers have explained, a word that transcends both affirmation and denial. It is not yes, and it is not no. It is something else entirely, something that can only be understood through direct experience. In Rinzai Zen, a student might be assigned the Mu koan as their very first practice. They are told to sit in meditation and to concentrate on the word mu with every fiber of their being. Not to think about it, not to analyze it, not to try to work out some clever answer, but to become mu, to let the question penetrate so deeply into their consciousness that the boundary between the questioner and the question dissolves. This can take days, weeks, months, or years. The student sits with mu. They carry mu with them when they walk, when they eat, when they work. Mu becomes a burning ball of doubt lodged in their belly, a question that refuses to be answered by any intellectual means. And at some point, if the practice is genuine and the effort is sustained, something breaks. The edifice of conceptual thinking, which the koan has been systematically undermining, collapses under its own weight, and what is left is a direct, unmediated encounter with reality that no words can adequately describe. This is what Zen calls kensho, or satori, an awakening, a seeing into one's own nature. It is not an idea. It is not a belief. It is an experience, as immediate and undeniable as the taste of water or the feeling of sunlight on your skin. This is the genius of the koan method. It uses language against itself. It takes words, which are the mind's primary tool for constructing the illusion of a fixed, knowable, separate reality, and turns them into instruments of their own undoing. The koan does not explain the truth. It creates the conditions under which the truth can be experienced directly. It is like using a thorn to remove a thorn from your foot. You do not keep the second thorn. You throw both away. But the koan is not something a student works on alone. It requires a teacher. In traditional Rinzai training, the student regularly meets with the teacher in a private interview called dokusen, or sanzen. In these meetings, the student presents their understanding of the koan, and the teacher responds. If the student's response comes from the intellect, from clever reasoning or borrowed concepts, the teacher will reject it, sometimes gently, sometimes fiercely. The teacher is not looking for a correct answer in the conventional sense. They are looking for a response that arises from genuine insight, from direct experience. And they can tell the difference. A response born of true seeing has a different quality, a different energy, than one manufactured by the thinking mind. It might come as a word, a gesture, a silence, a laugh. What matters is not the form, but the authenticity of the experience behind it. This teacher-student dynamic is itself a form of direct transmission. The teacher uses the koan as a device, but the real transmission happens in the meeting between two minds. The teacher's job is to see the student clearly, to intuit where they are stuck, to apply exactly the right pressure, whether through encouragement, challenge, silence, or confrontation, to help the student break through their own barriers. It is deeply personal work, tailored to the individual. What works for one student may be completely wrong for another. This is why Zen has always insisted that the Dharma cannot be learned from a book. You need a living teacher who can respond to you in the moment, who can see you as you are right now, not as a category, or a case study. Some of the most beloved stories in Zen involve masters using wildly unconventional methods to provoke awakening. The master Gyude, whenever asked about Zen, would simply raise one finger. The master Deshin was famous for answering questions with a blow of his stick. The master Linji, founder of the lineage that bears his name, used shouts so fierce they reportedly sent monks reeling. The master Nanquin, when two groups of monks quarreled over a cat, picked up the cat and threatened to cut it in half. When no one could say a word that stopped him, he followed through. Later, when his student Jeju heard about the incident and placed his sandals on his head, Nanquin sighed and said, "If you had been there, you could have saved the cat." These stories can seem bizarre, even disturbing to outsiders, but within the context of Zen training, each one is a carefully aimed intervention designed to cut through the student's conceptual armor and provoke a direct encounter with reality. The finger, the stick, the shout, the cut, the sandals on the head. These are all instances of direct pointing, wordless or near-wordless transmissions in which the teacher uses whatever means are available to redirect the student's attention from the world of concepts to the world of immediate experience. Hakuin Ekaku, the great 18th century Japanese Rinzai master, who essentially revitalized the Rinzai tradition single-handedly, created a systematic curriculum of koans that students progress through over the course of many years. He believed that the initial breakthrough of Kensho, while essential, was only the beginning. After the first glimpse of awakened reality, the student needed to deepen and stabilize their insight through continued practice with increasingly subtle koans, eventually integrating their realization into every aspect of daily life. Hakuin himself is said to have experienced his first Kensho as a young man, but spent decades deepening his understanding through further practice. He is credited with creating the famous koan, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" And he was a prolific artist, calligrapher, and writer as well, producing hundreds of ink paintings and written works that expressed the Zen spirit with extraordinary vitality. The koan tradition represents one of Zen's most powerful answers to the paradox of direct transmission. You cannot give someone an experience, but you can create the conditions under which their own experience breaks free from the cage of conceptual thinking. The koan is a cage-breaking tool, and the teacher who wields it is not an authority figure dispensing wisdom from above, but a fellow traveler who has walked the same path, hit the same walls, and found a way through. There is a famous story about the Rinzai master Tazen, who was asked by a monk, "What is Buddha?" Tazen replied, 3 pounds of flax. The answer makes no logical sense. It was not meant to. What Tazen was doing in the moment of being asked was responding with whatever was immediately at hand, whatever was most alive in the present moment. Some accounts suggest he was weighing flax at the time the question was asked. The point is not the content of the answer, but the quality of presence behind it. Tazen was not thinking about the question. He was not rifling through his mental filing cabinet for the correct doctrinal response. He was fully here, fully alive, and his answer arose from that aliveness, the way a bird's song arises from the bird. It was spontaneous, unrehearsed, and utterly authentic. And in that authenticity, in that absolute freedom from conceptual grasping, the truth of what is Buddha was expressed more completely than any theological treatise could express it. This is what makes the koan tradition so different from academic philosophy. In philosophy, you are expected to reason your way to a conclusion. The process is deliberate, step-by-step, logical. In koan practice, reasoning is precisely what you are expected to abandon. The koan is designed to bring you to the very edge of what thinking can accomplish, and then push you off the cliff. What happens after that? The fall, the dissolution, the landing in a place you did not know existed, is not something that can be predicted or controlled. It is wild, it is dangerous, and it is, for those who go through it, the most liberating experience of their lives. Not every practitioner works with koans. Not every teacher assigns them. But the spirit of the koan, the willingness to sit with impossible questions, to let go of the need for neat answers, to trust the process even when it makes no sense, pervades all of Zen practice. Every moment of sitting in zazen, facing the wall, confronting the endless stream of thoughts and impulses and distractions without fleeing from them, is in its own way a koan. The question, who am I, is a koan. The question, what is this moment, is a koan. Life itself, in its fullness and complexity and irreducible strangeness, is the ultimate koan. And the only way to answer it is to live it directly, without the mediating filter of concepts and explanations, one breath at a time. At the center of Zen's understanding of itself is the idea of lineage, an unbroken chain of mind-to-mind transmission, stretching from the historical Buddha all the way down to the present day. Every authorized Zen teacher can, in principle, trace their spiritual ancestry back through a specific line of teachers and students, generation by generation, until they arrive at Bodhidharma, then back through the 27 Indian patriarchs to Mahakasyapa, and from Mahakasyapa to the Buddha himself. This chain is the living infrastructure of direct transmission. It is the means by which the wordless insight first shared on Vulture Peak, or at least the tradition's understanding of that insight, has been preserved and conveyed across 2,500 years of human history. The formal ritual that marks the passing of this lineage from teacher to student is called Dharma transmission. In the Soto Zen tradition, it is an elaborate, week-long ceremony conducted mostly in private, sometimes even in secret, in which the teacher and student engage in a series of rituals, dialogues, and practices that acknowledge and celebrate the student's readiness to carry on the lineage. The student receives new robes, a Dharma name, and a lineage document that lists every teacher in the chain of transmission going back to the Buddha. In the Rinzai tradition, the equivalent is called inka, formal authorization to teach, which typically comes after the student has completed an extensive curriculum of koans and demonstrated their ability to respond to the Dharma with authentic insight. The relationship between teacher and student in Zen is often compared to family bonds. The teacher is described as a Dharma parent, and fellow students of the same teacher are Dharma siblings. The Japanese scholar William Bodiford has identified several dimensions that Dharma lineage shares with family relationships: ancestral, biological, linguistic, ritual, and legal dimensions that together create a comprehensive web of connection and obligation. Dharma heirs receive new names that reflect their tie to the Dharma family. Rituals confirm and celebrate the relationships. Teachers have obligations to guide and sometimes discipline their students, just as students have obligations of respect and dedication toward their teachers. This is beautiful, and it is also complicated. The history of Dharma transmission is not a clean, unbroken line of perfected masters handing the torch to equally perfected successors. There are gaps, fabrications, and controversies scattered throughout Zen history. Some of the early Indian patriarchs listed in Zen's ancestral lineage are historically dubious. Some transmissions were influenced by politics, institutional ambition, or personal favoritism as much as by genuine spiritual insight. In the modern era, particularly as Zen has moved to the West, there have been painful scandals involving teachers who received Dharma transmission, but whose behavior was clearly at odds with Buddhist ethical principles. The Zen tradition is, for the most part, honest about these complications. One of John McRae's famous rules of Zen study states, "It's not true, and therefore it's more important." This captures an essential insight. The lineage may not be historically flawless, but the principle it embodies, that awakening is best verified and transmitted through a personal, face-to-face relationship between teacher and student, remains profoundly important. What matters is not whether every name on the lineage chart represents a perfectly enlightened being, but whether the practice of direct, personal verification continues. The teacher meets the student. The teacher sees the student. The student's understanding is tested, challenged, confirmed, or corrected. This process, imperfect and human as it is, provides a safeguard against self-deception that no amount of solitary practice or textual study can replicate. There is a Zen metaphor that describes the transmission as pouring water from one vessel into another, exactly like it. The image suggests a perfect transfer of understanding, but in reality, each vessel is slightly different, shaped by its own history, culture, and personality. And this is not a flaw, but a feature. Each generation of Zen teachers brings something new to the tradition, not by adding new doctrines, but by embodying the timeless insight in a fresh, contemporary way. The moon is always the same moon, but each person who sees it from a slightly different angle, in a slightly different sky. This is why Zen, despite its emphasis on tradition and lineage, has been remarkably adaptable, flourishing in cultures as different as medieval China, feudal Japan, and the modern West. One of the most remarkable chapters in the history of Dharma transmission unfolded in the 20th century, when the lineage crossed the Pacific and took root in the West. In 1959, a Soto Zen priest named Shunryu Suzuki arrived in San Francisco to serve as head priest of Sokoji, a small Japanese-American temple in Japantown. He was 55 years old. He had no grand plans to revolutionize Western spirituality. He simply sat zazen every morning at 6 and let it be known that anyone was welcome to join him. Gradually, people started showing up, mostly young Americans at the tail end of the Beat movement, drawn by the writings of Alan Watts and D.T. Suzuki. Curious about this quiet Japanese priest who seemed to embody something they had only read about in books. Within a few years, there were more Western students at Sokoji than Japanese-American congregants. In 1962, Suzuki and his American students formally established the San Francisco Zen Center. By 1967, they had purchased Tasajara Hot Springs in the mountains of Central California and transformed it into the first Zen Buddhist monastery outside of Asia. Suzuki Roshi, as his students called him, died of cancer in 1971 after just 12 years in America. But in those 12 years, he had planted a seed that would grow into one of the most significant spiritual communities in the Western world. His book Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, compiled from his informal talks, became one of the most widely read introductions to Zen in any language. And the lineage he transmitted, warm hand to warm hand, as the San Francisco Zen Center describes it, has now spread through dozens of affiliated practice centers across the country and around the world. The story of Suzuki Roshi in San Francisco is, in many ways, a modern retelling of the ancient pattern. A teacher arrives, a community gathers, and something invisible passes between them that transforms lives. It is also a story that illustrates the messiness and complexity of real human transmission. After Suzuki's death, his successor, Richard Baker, presided over an expansion of the Zen Center that included the creation of Green Gulch Farm, a pioneering organic farming community, and Green's Restaurant, one of America's first gourmet vegetarian restaurants. But Baker's tenure was also marked by controversy, and he eventually stepped down amid painful internal conflicts that tested the community's resilience. The lineage survived. It adapted. It grew in new directions, and in doing so, it demonstrated something essential about the nature of transmission. It is not a fragile thread that breaks at the first sign of trouble. It is a living, growing thing, capable of absorbing shocks, learning from failures, and finding new forms of expression in new circumstances. At its best, the teacher-student relationship in Zen is one of extraordinary intimacy and mutual trust. The student opens themselves completely to the teacher's scrutiny, bringing not just their formal practice, but their whole life, their fears, their confusions, their habitual patterns, into the light of the teacher's awareness. And the teacher, in turn, offers not just instruction, but their own vulnerability, their own ongoing practice, their own humanity. Dharma transmission, at its deepest level, is not the conferring of a title or the granting of authority. It is a moment of mutual recognition, when teacher and student see the same truth in each other's eyes and acknowledge that seeing. It is, in a profound sense, a repetition of the original scene on Vulture Peak. One person holds up a flower, another person smiles, and something wordless passes between them that changes everything. If the koan is one wing of Zen's approach to direct experience, Zazen, sitting meditation, is the other. And in many ways, Zazen is the more fundamental of the two, the ground from which everything else in Zen grows. The word Zazen simply means sitting meditation, from the Japanese za for sitting and zen for meditation. But the simplicity of the name belies the depth of the practice. In its most basic physical form, Zazen involves sitting on a cushion in a stable, erect posture, with the legs crossed in a lotus or half-lotus position, the spine straight, the chin slightly tucked, the eyes half open and cast downward, and the hands folded in the cosmic mudra, left hand resting on the right, with thumbs lightly touching. the breath is allowed to flow naturally, without any attempt to control or manipulate it. And the mind is allowed to settle, not by forcefully suppressing thoughts, but by simply not following them, letting them arise and pass away the way clouds move across an empty sky. That is the technique, the entire technique. It fits in a single paragraph, and yet people spend their entire lives exploring its depths. There is something worth pausing over in the physical posture itself. The crossed legs create a stable, triangular base. The straight spine balances the torso above that base without muscular effort, allowing the body to rest in a kind of alert stillness, neither rigid nor slack. The half-open eyes, cast downward at a 45-degree angle, prevent the drowsiness that comes with closing the eyes, while also avoiding the distraction of looking around the room. The cosmic mudra, with its thumbs lightly touching, serves as a subtle barometer of attention. When the mind wanders, the thumbs tend to separate or press together too hard. When attention is present, the thumbs maintain their light contact effortlessly. The body in Zazen is not something you transcend or escape from. It is your primary instrument of awareness. The ache in your knee, the tension in your shoulder, the growl of your stomach, these are not obstacles to practice. They are practicing. They are the raw, unedited experience of being alive in a body, and learning to sit with them without resistance or aversion is itself a profound form of waking up. This emphasis on the body distinguishes Zen from many other contemplative traditions, which sometimes treat the physical as a distraction from the spiritual. In Zen, there is no such separation. The body sitting on the cushion is the Buddha sitting under the Bodhi tree. The breath moving in and out of your lungs is the same breath that moves through every living creature on this planet. The physical world, experienced directly and without conceptual overlay, is not a veil concealing some deeper spiritual reality. It is the spiritual reality. This is what Zen means when it speaks of the ordinary as the ultimate. Not that there is no difference between delusion and awakening, but that the awakened eye sees the ultimate shining in and through every ordinary thing. What happens when you sit in a zazen is, at first, not very impressive. You sit down, you try to be still. Your mind immediately begins its familiar routine: planning, worrying, reminiscing, fantasizing, judging, narrating. Your body protests. Your knees ache, your back stiffens, your nose itches. You realize, perhaps for the first time, just how relentlessly active your mind is, how desperately it resists any attempt to simply be present without doing something. The Zen teacher Karen Miesen-Miller, describing the wall-gazing meditation that traces back to Bodhidharma, captures this experience vividly. When confronted with the absence of stimulation, the egocentric mind revs into overdrive. Thoughts race, fantasies multiply, self-criticism pours in. I don't like this. I can't do this. I quit. It is a bracing glimpse of what the ego does for you 24 hours a day, every day of your life. But with practice, with patience, with the support of a community and a teacher, something begins to shift. The thoughts do not stop exactly, but they begin to lose their grip. You start to notice the space between thoughts, the silence behind the noise, the awareness within which thoughts and sensations arise and dissolve. And that awareness, that space, that silence begins to feel more fundamental, more real than the content that moves through it. It is as if you had spent your entire life watching a movie projected on a screen, and then, for the first time, noticed the screen itself. Vast, luminous, unchanged by whatever images appear on it. This is not a metaphor, or rather, it is a metaphor, but it points to something that practitioners actually experience. The Zen master Shunryu Suzuki, whose book Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, is one of the most widely read introductions to Zen in the English language, described this experience simply. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few. Zazen is, in a sense, the practice of recovering a beginner's mind. The fresh, open, uncluttered awareness of a child encountering the world for the first time, before the accumulation of concepts and categories has divided reality into neat, familiar boxes. In the Soto Zen tradition, the practice of Zazen is called shikantaza, which translates roughly as just sitting. It is Zazen without a specific object of concentration, without a koan to work on, without any goal whatsoever. You simply sit, alert and aware, with no agenda. This sounds easy. It is, in fact, one of the most difficult things a human being can do. We are so accustomed to having a purpose, a project, a destination, that the practice of purposeless sitting feels almost existentially threatening. What am I doing? What is the point? Am I wasting my time? Shouldn't I be accomplishing something? But the whole point of shikantaza is to encounter these questions, these anxieties, these habitual impulses, and to sit with them without acting on them. Over time, the compulsive need to be doing something begins to relax. And in that relaxation, something remarkable becomes available. A quality of awareness that is not oriented toward achieving a future goal, but is fully alive in the present moment. This is what Dogen, the founder of Soto Zen in Japan, meant when he said, "Practice is enlightenment." Sitting is not a means to an end. It is the end itself. When you sit in Zazen with no agenda, no goal, no striving, you are already expressing the very enlightenment you think you are seeking. Zazen is direct experience in its purest form. There is no mediating concept, no teaching, no explanation. There is just you, sitting on a cushion, facing a wall or the empty space in front of you, breathing. Everything else, all the philosophy, all the history, all the koans, all the scriptures, is commentary on this single, radical act. The act of simply being present, fully alive, right here, right now. As the Zen Studies Society describes it, Zen is the direct experience of what we might call ultimate reality, or the absolute. Yet it is not separate from the ordinary, the relative. Zazen is the practice in which the ordinary and the ultimate meet. You sit on a cushion, you breathe, and in that ordinariness, something extraordinary becomes available. Not because it was brought in from outside, but because it was always there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for you to stop looking elsewhere and notice it. But Zazen does not exist only in solitude. From the earliest days of Chan Buddhism, practitioners have gathered together for intensive periods of group practice called sesshin. The word sesshin literally means collecting the mind or touching the heart-mind. And it describes a retreat of concentrated meditation lasting anywhere from 2 days to a full week. During sesshin, participants follow a schedule of almost monastic simplicity. The day begins before dawn. often at 4 or 4:30 in the morning, with the sharp ring of a wake-up bell cutting through the dark silence. Within 20 minutes, everyone is in the meditation hall, sitting their first period of Zazen. From that point forward, the day unfolds as a continuous stream of practice, sitting meditation in periods of 25 to 40 minutes each, separated by brief intervals of kinhin, or walking meditation, in which practitioners slowly pace around the room in single file, each step timed to the breath, each movement an extension of the same awareness cultivated on the cushion. At many Zen centers, session includes 10 to 12 hours of formal zazen each day. Meals are eaten in silence, often in the meditation hall itself, following formal eating rituals that transform the simple act of receiving food into yet another form of practice. There is a period of work practice, usually no more than 45 minutes, during which participants sweep, scrub, garden, or cook, again in silence, again with the same quality of attention they bring to the cushion. There are Dharma talks given by the teacher, brief moments of chanting, and private meetings between student and teacher, in which the student's practice is examined and guided. And then, after the final period of evening meditation, which often does not end until 9 or 10 at night, there is sleep, sometimes as little as 5 or 6 hours, before the bell rings again and the cycle begins anew. The first day of a session is usually the hardest. The body protests, the knees ache, the lower back stiffens into a hot knot of tension. The mind, deprived of its usual diet of stimulation, phones, conversations, news, entertainment, goes into a kind of withdrawal. Thoughts race, fantasies multiply, inner monologues become deafening. Many practitioners describe the first day as a confrontation with the full force of their mental habits, a bracing and sometimes alarming glimpse of just how ceaselessly the mind chatters when given nothing external to occupy it. But by the second or third day, something begins to shift. The body finds its way into the posture. The breath deepens. The incessant mental noise, while it does not disappear, begins to lose its urgency, its grip. Colors seem brighter, sounds seem clearer. The taste of rice at breakfast becomes startlingly vivid. Many long-term practitioners describe this shift as a gradual dissolution of the boundary between formal practice and ordinary life, until there is no longer a distinction between sitting on the cushion and walking to the bathroom, between the meditation bell and the sound of rain on the roof. Everything becomes practice. Everything becomes present. The Rochester Zen Center describes this well. In a week-long session, one can accomplish what would take years to accomplish on one's own, and the reason is not magic or supernatural intervention. It is simply the cumulative effect of sustained, concentrated attention, supported by the collective energy of a group of people who are all doing the same thing at the same time, in the same space, with the same intention. The most challenging session of the year in many Zen traditions is the Rohatsu session, held in early December to commemorate the Buddha's enlightenment. During Rohatsu, the schedule intensifies. Some monasteries begin even earlier, at 3:45 in the morning. The sitting periods may extend to 11 hours or more. On the final night, it is traditional for practitioners to sit through the entire night without sleeping, just as the Buddha is said to have sat through the night before his awakening at the sight of the morning star. This is not endurance for its own sake. It is a way of pushing past the mind's habitual defenses, past the comfortable routines that keep the ego intact, into a raw, open space where genuine insight becomes possible. Not every practitioner experiences a breakthrough during Rohatsu, but the willingness to sit through the night, to face exhaustion and discomfort, and the relentless voice of the mind saying, "This is pointless, you should quit," is itself a profound act of practice. It is the body's way of saying what the mouth cannot. I am willing to sit here, in this uncertainty, in this discomfort, until something real emerges. As Chan Buddhism matured in China and then traveled to Japan, it branched into two major schools that would represent two distinct approaches to the question of direct experience. These are the Rinzai and Soto schools. And while their differences have sometimes been exaggerated, understanding them helps illuminate the full range of possibilities within the tradition of direct transmission. The Rinzai school, named after the Chinese master Linji Yixuan, who died in 866, is the more dramatic of the two. If Zen had a branch devoted to shock therapy, Rinzai would be it. Linji was legendary for his fierce, uncompromising style. He used shouts, blows, and paradoxical statements to jolt students out of complacency and into direct awareness. He told his students to kill the Buddha if they met him on the road, not as a literal instruction, but as a radical teaching against idolizing any external authority, even the most sacred. His approach was swift, unpredictable, and intensely personal. When the Rinzai tradition was brought to Japan, most definitively by the monk Eisai in the late 12th century, it was adopted by the samurai warrior class and the ruling military government. Eisai, who had traveled twice to China and received transmission in the Rinzai lineage, did not initially set out to found a new school. He saw himself as a reformer, someone who wanted to revitalize Japanese Buddhism. By reintroducing the disciplined meditation practice he had encountered on the mainland, he also brought back tea seeds from China and is often credited with popularizing the drinking of tea in Japan, a seemingly minor detail that would eventually blossom into the elaborate art of the Japanese tea ceremony. One of the most refined expressions of Zen aesthetics in the world. There is a Japanese saying that captures the cultural divide between the two schools: Rinzai for the shogun, Soto for the peasants. The saying is a simplification, but it contains a grain of truth. Rinzai's emphasis on sudden, dramatic breakthroughs and rigorous mental discipline appealed to the warrior mentality. The samurai valued decisiveness, fearlessness, and the ability to act spontaneously without hesitation, qualities that Rinzai koan practice cultivated. The influence flowed both ways. Rinzai Zen contributed significantly to Japanese martial arts, calligraphy, ink painting, poetry, garden design, and the tea ceremony, helping to create the aesthetic of spare, elegant simplicity that the world now associates with Japanese culture. Consider the Zen rock garden, perhaps the most iconic visual symbol of this aesthetic. The garden at Ryunji Temple in Kyoto, which dates to the late 15th century, consists of nothing more than 15 rocks arranged in 5 groups on a bed of carefully raked white gravel, enclosed by low clay walls stained with age. There are no trees, no flowers, no water, just rocks and gravel and space. And yet this arrangement has fascinated visitors for over 500 years. It has been called the greatest work of abstract art in the world. It has been analyzed, interpreted, and debated endlessly. Is it a representation of islands in the sea, mountains rising above clouds, a mother tiger carrying her cubs across a river? The beauty of the garden lies in the fact that it resists all of these interpretations. It is what it is, rocks on gravel. And in that simplicity, in that refusal to be anything other than what it is, it embodies the Zen principle of direct experience more eloquently than any number of words could. The Rinzai school, as revitalized by the great master Hakuin Ekaku in the 18th century, places koan practice at the center of its training. Students progress through a structured curriculum of koans, each designed to deepen and refine their insight. The initial koans, like Joshu's Mu, aim at producing the first breakthrough experience of Kensho. Subsequent koans explore subtler aspects of reality, including the relationship between the absolute and the relative, the nature of compassion, and the integration of insight into everyday life. The process can take decades. It requires regular, intensive session retreats, periods of concentrated practice lasting several days to a week, during which practitioners may sit in meditation for 10 or more hours a day. The Soto school took a different path. Its Chinese ancestor is the Keidong school, founded by the masters Dongshin and Keishin in the 9th century. In Japan, Soto Zen was established by Eihei Dojin, who traveled to China in the 13th century, received Dharma transmission in the Keidong lineage, and returned to Japan to found Aiheiji, the great mountain monastery that remains the spiritual center of Soto Zen to this day. Aiheiji, whose name means Temple of Eternal Peace, sits deep in the mountains of Fukui Prefecture, surrounded by ancient cedar trees so tall that they block most of the sky. Even today, the monastery follows a schedule that Dojin himself would recognize. Monks rise before dawn, sit zazen, perform elaborate chanting services, eat formal meals in silence, work, study, and sit again. Day after day, year after year, the training is demanding. New monks undergo a period called Tangaryo, in which they must sit in meditation continuously for several days to prove their sincerity before being admitted to the community. Everything at Aiheiji, from the way the monks walk through the corridors to the way they fold their towels, is prescribed in detail by monastic codes that trace back to Dojin's original regulations. This is not rigidity for its own sake. It is an expression of Dojin's belief that every activity, no matter how mundane, can be a vehicle for awakening when performed with complete attention and care. Dojin's approach to Zen was, in some respects, the mirror image of Rinzai's. Where Rinzai emphasized the dramatic moment of Kensho, the sudden shattering of the conceptual mind, Dojin emphasized the ongoing, moment-by-moment practice of Zazen as itself the expression of enlightenment. There is nothing to attain, Dojin taught, because your original nature is already complete. The practice of shikantaza, just sitting, is not a means to the end of enlightenment. It is enlightenment in action. When you sit without agenda, without striving, without the desire for some special experience, you are already manifesting the Buddha's own activity. Practice and realization are not two separate things. They are one. This might sound passive, even defeatist. If you are already enlightened, why bother practicing? But Dogen's teaching is more subtle than that. He is not saying that there is nothing to do. He is saying that the doing itself, when it is free from self-centered striving, is the expression of awakened reality. It is the difference between a musician who plays to get somewhere, constantly thinking about the next concert or the next achievement, and a musician who plays because the music itself is the point, because the act of playing is already complete in every note. Both musicians practice, but the quality of their playing and the quality of their lives is profoundly different. The distinction between Rinzai and Soto has sometimes been characterized as the difference between sudden and gradual enlightenment. Rinzai goes for the dramatic breakthrough. Soto cultivates a steady, patient unfolding. But this characterization, while not entirely wrong, is misleading. Both schools trace their ancestry back to Huineng and the Southern School of Chan, which championed sudden enlightenment. Both acknowledge that practice involves both sudden insight and gradual cultivation. The difference is more one of emphasis and style than of fundamental doctrine. As one contemporary teacher put it, in both cases, you are laying train tracks, and awareness will arrive like a freight train when the tracks are complete. The difference is whether you celebrate the moment the train arrives, or the process of laying each individual rail. In practice, many modern Zen teachers draw from both traditions. The Sanbo Kyodan school, founded by Yasutani Hakun in the 20th century, combined elements of Soto Shikantaza with Rinzai koan practice. And this synthesis has been enormously influential in the spread of Zen to the West. Many Western Zen centers offer both sitting practice and koan work, allowing students to find the approach that resonates most deeply with their own temperament and needs. What both schools share is the fundamental conviction that the truth of Zen is something to be experienced directly, not merely understood intellectually. Whether that experience comes through the shattering of a koan or the silent unfolding of shikantaza, the result is the same: a direct, personal encounter with the nature of reality that no amount of reading, studying, or philosophizing can substitute for. One of the most beautiful expressions of this shared conviction is the tradition of the 10 ox-herding pictures, a series of ink drawings accompanied by short poems that has been used since the 12th century to depict the stages of a practitioner's journey toward awakening. The most famous version was created by the Chinese Rinzai Chan master Kyun Shiyuan, and the oldest known Japanese illustrated copy, a hand scroll now housed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, dates to 1278. The pictures tell a deceptively simple story. A young herder has lost his ox. He searches for it through fields and forests. He finds its footprints. He catches a glimpse of the animal. He struggles to catch it, to tame it, to ride it home. And then, in the later pictures, something unexpected happens. The ox disappears. The herder disappears. Everything disappears into an empty circle, a visual echo of the shunyata, or emptiness, that lies at the heart of Buddhist philosophy. But the sequence does not end there. In the final pictures, the world reappears. Flowers bloom, rivers flow, and the herder, now transformed, walks back into the marketplace with open hands, ready to help others. The ox in these pictures represents our original nature, the awakened mind that has never actually been lost, but that we have forgotten how to see. The herder's journey, with all its effort, struggle, and eventual release, mirrors the practitioner's path through Zen training. What makes the pictures so enduring and so relevant to both Rinzai and Soto approaches is the way they end. The goal is not to escape the world. The goal is not to remain in blissful emptiness. The goal is to return to ordinary life, to the marketplace, to the world of chopping wood and carrying water, but to return transformed, seeing everything with fresh eyes, responding to the world with a compassion and presence that were not available before. The ox herding pictures remind us that enlightenment is not a destination. It is a return to where we have always been, but with the eyes finally open. Of all the figures in Zen history, none more brilliantly illuminated the paradox of using language to point beyond language than the Japanese master Eihei Dojin. Born into an aristocratic family in Kyoto in 1200, orphaned as a child, ordained as a Buddhist monk at 13, Dojin was haunted from an early age by a question that would drive his entire spiritual career. If all beings inherently possess Buddha nature, as Mahayana Buddhism teaches, why is practice necessary? If we are already enlightened, what is the point of the arduous discipline of meditation? This question led Dojin to China in 1223, where he studied under the Chan master Tiantong Rujing. Under Rujing's guidance, Dojin experienced what he would later describe as the dropping away of body and mind, a phrase that became central to his teaching. When he returned to Japan, he was a transformed man, burning with the desire to share what he had discovered. Over the next 3 decades, until his death in 1253, he produced one of the most extraordinary bodies of spiritual literature in human history, the Shabo Genzo, or Treasury of the True Dharma Eye, a collection of essays that are simultaneously some of the most profound and most baffling texts in all of Buddhist philosophy. What makes Dojin relevant to our exploration of direct transmission is his radical relationship with language. He was, among Zen masters, unusual in his deep engagement with writing. Most Zen masters have left behind relatively few written works, preferring to teach through direct encounter, through koans, through the example of their own lives. Dojin, by contrast, was an astonishingly prolific writer. The Shabo Genzo alone runs to dozens of volumes. He also produced extensive monastic regulations, sermon collections, and poetry in both Japanese and Chinese. He was a master stylist, capable of writing prose so dense and elusive that it has kept scholars busy for centuries, as well as poetry of exquisite simplicity and beauty. And yet Dojin never abandoned the fundamental Zen insight that truth transcends words. What he did was something far more interesting. He used language in a way that was itself a form of direct pointing. The scholar Norman Fisher has described Dojin's approach this way. Dojin was unusual among Asian Zen masters for 2 reasons. First, he wrote and was deeply interested in writing and language. Second, he saw the need to reinterpret the Zen tradition based on this sensitivity to language. His reinterpretation was radically non-dual. He He saw that earlier Zen masters, in their effort to go beyond the dualism of ordinary Buddhism, had inadvertently created new dualisms: meditation good, thinking bad, action good, reflection bad, silence good, speech bad. Dogen refused to rest in any of these dualisms. The sometimes baffling quality of his writing comes from his refusal to ever settle into a fixed position. Dogen distinguished between two types of language. The first is ordinary discursive language, the kind we use every day to categorize, analyze, and navigate the world. This kind of language, Dogen acknowledged, can never capture the nature of reality. But there is a second kind of language, which he called Dadoku, or perfect expression. This is language that does not merely describe reality from the outside, but actually participates in it. Language that is itself a form of awakened activity. When a Zen master speaks from genuine insight, the words they use are not separate from the truth they express. The finger and the moon, at that moment, are not two things. One of Dogen's most famous passages comes from the Genjikon, the first and most important essay in the Shabogenzo. To study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be enlightened by all things of the universe. To be enlightened by all things of the universe is to cast off the body and mind of the self, as well as those of others. Even the traces of enlightenment are wiped out, and life with traceless enlightenment goes on forever and ever. This is a language operating at the level of direct pointing. It is not explaining enlightenment from the outside. It is enacting enlightenment, performing the very movement of understanding it describes. Each sentence builds on the previous one and simultaneously undermines it. You study the self, but the study leads to forgetting the self. You are enlightened by all things, but even the enlightenment must be let go of. There is no resting place, no final conclusion, no concept that you can grab onto and say, "This is what Dogen means." The meaning is in the movement itself, the continual letting go, the refusal to fixate. Another of Dogen's revolutionary contributions was his teaching on the relationship between practice and enlightenment. The conventional Buddhist view, which he encountered in the Tendai school where he first trained, held that enlightenment is the goal toward which practice is directed. You sit in meditation now in order to become enlightened later. Dogen rejected this view completely. He taught that practice and enlightenment are not two separate things, but one. Every moment of genuine practice is itself the expression of enlightenment. Zazen is not a ladder you climb to reach the roof. Zazen is standing on the roof. When you sit in shikantaza without seeking anything, without trying to achieve anything, you are already doing what the Buddha did under the Bodhi tree. The only difference is that the Buddha recognized it, and you, perhaps, have not yet recognized it in yourself. This teaching, which Dogen called practice realization, shasho, has profound implications for the idea of direct transmission. If practice and enlightenment are one, then every moment of sitting, every breath, every step in walking meditation, every act of washing dishes or sweeping the floor is itself a direct encounter with the truth. Transmission is not something that happens only in the rare, dramatic moments when a master holds up a flower and a student smiles. It is happening continuously, in every moment, in every activity, Whenever awareness is present without grasping, Dogen's picture of a rice cake takes on the common Zen saying, "A picture of a rice cake does not satisfy hunger." The saying is usually understood as a warning against mistaking words for reality, descriptions for experience. But Dogen, characteristically, flips the meaning. A picture of a rice cake, he argues, is not separate from a real rice cake. Painting a rice cake and eating a rice cake are both activities within the seamless reality of the present moment. To draw a sharp line between pictures and real things, between words and experience, between descriptions and the described, is itself a form of dualistic thinking that Zen is supposed to overcome. This does not mean that Dogen believed you could eat a painting. It means that he refused to divide reality into neat categories of real and unreal, words and things, transmission and non-transmission. Everything, when experienced with full awareness, is transmission. Everything, when experienced through the fog of conceptual grasping, is obstruction. This is a teaching that only a master of language could deliver. And it is a teaching that uses language, paradoxically, to heal the wound that language itself has inflicted on our understanding of reality. Perhaps no single passage in all of Dogen's writing captures the flavor of his thought more vividly than the firewood and ash passage in the Genjikon. The essay scholars consider the most accessible entry point into the Shabogenzo. In it, Dogen writes that firewood becomes ash and does not become firewood again. Simple enough. But then he adds, "Do not suppose that the ash is after and the firewood before. Firewood," he says, "abides in its own Dharma position, fully including before and after, while being independent of before and after. Ash, likewise, abides in its own Dharma position. This is baffling on first encounter, and it is meant to be." What Dogen is doing is dismantling our habitual way of thinking about time, change, and identity. We normally see firewood and ash as two stages of the same process. First, there is firewood, then it burns, and afterward, there is ash. But Dogen insists that this linear way of seeing misses something essential. Firewood, in the moment when it is firewood, is completely firewood. It is not pre-ash. It is not on its way to becoming something else. It is fully and completely itself, right now, at this moment. And ash, when it is ash, is fully and completely ash, not post-firewood, not the remains of something that used to be. Ash in its own right, in its own moment, in its own Dharma position. The teaching is not just about firewood and ash. It is about life and death. It is about practice and enlightenment. It is about you, right now, reading these words or hearing this voice. You are not pre-enlightened. You are not on your way to becoming a better, more awakened version of yourself. You are fully and completely yourself in this moment, in your own Dharma position. And this moment, just as it is, fully includes before and after while being independent of before and after. It is complete. It lacks nothing. If you can see this, truly see it, not as an idea, but as a living reality, then the distinction between delusion and enlightenment collapses. Not because there is no difference between them, but because each one, in its own moment, is complete. Scholars have spent centuries wrestling with this passage, and Zen practitioners have spent centuries sitting with it. And neither the scholars nor the practitioners have exhausted its meaning. This is precisely the kind of language that Dogen excelled at. Language that does not explain, but enacts. Language that does not point at the truth from a safe distance, but pulls you into the truth whether you are ready or not. It is a language with direct transmission. Imagine yourself sitting in a room. There is nothing unusual about this room. It has walls, a floor, and a ceiling. Perhaps there is a window, and through the window, you can see trees, sky, and the movement of clouds. You are sitting quietly, and your attention is here in this room at this moment. You are not thinking about the past or the future. You are not analyzing, judging, or planning. You are simply here. Now, at this moment, where is the boundary between you and the room? If you are truly present, truly paying attention without the filter of conceptual thinking, can you find the precise point where you ends and the room begins? The air enters your lungs, becomes part of your body, and then leaves again. The light that strikes your eyes becomes a neurological event in your brain. The sounds that reach your ears become vibrations in your inner ear, become electrical signals, and become the experience of hearing. At what point in this process does the outside become the inside? Where is the line? This is the kind of seeing that direct transmission points toward, not a mystical, otherworldly vision of heavenly realms, but a simple, clear, almost ordinary recognition that the boundaries we draw between self and world, between subject and object, between the one who experiences and the experience itself, are not as solid as we have always assumed. They are useful conventions, like lines on a map, but they are not the territory. And this is where the ancient teaching of direct transmission becomes startlingly relevant to our modern lives. We live in what may be the most word-saturated, information-dense environment in human history. We are drowning in language. Every waking hour brings a torrent of texts, emails, notifications, headlines, advertisements, podcasts, videos, and social media posts. We process more words in a single day than our great-grandparents might have processed in a month. And yet, for all this communication, many of us feel more disconnected than ever from ourselves, from each other, from the natural world, from any sense of meaning or purpose that transcends the endless cycle of producing and consuming. Zen's ancient insistence that truth cannot be fully captured by language is not a quaint relic of a pre-modern worldview. It is a precise diagnosis of one of the central ailments of our time, the confusion of information with understanding, of data with wisdom, of talking about life with actually living it. We know more facts about more subjects than any civilization in history. We can access the sum total of human knowledge from a device in our pockets. And yet the direct experience of being alive, the raw, unmediated encounter with this moment, this breath, this heartbeat, remains as elusive as ever. The practice of Zazen, of sitting still and paying attention without an agenda, is one of the most powerful antidotes to this condition that has ever been devised. It is not about rejecting technology or retreating from the world. It is about recovering the capacity for direct experience that our information-saturated environment is steadily eroding. It is about remembering what it feels like to simply be here, without commentary, without narration, without the constant background hum of the mind trying to process and categorize and control everything. The old Zen saying goes, "Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The activities do not change. What changes is the quality of attention you bring to them. Before awakening, chopping wood is a chore, something to be endured on the way to something more interesting. After awakening, chopping wood is chopping wood. The weight of the axe, the grain of the wood, the sound of the split, the cool morning air on your skin, it is complete in itself. It needs no addition, no improvement, no meaning imposed from outside. It simply is. And that simple isness, that direct encounter with the thing itself, is what 2,500 years of Zen teachers have been pointing toward. Think about what this means in the context of your own daily life. You wake up in the morning, you brush your teeth, you make coffee, you walk to the car or the bus or the train, you spend hours at work, dealing with emails and meetings and deadlines. You eat lunch, often while staring at a screen. You come home, tired, and scroll through your phone while half watching something on television. You go to bed and start the whole cycle over again. In this routine, how many moments are you actually present for? How many of those experiences do you taste fully, hear fully, see fully, rather than experiencing them through the fog of mental commentary and anticipation and regret? Zen's teaching of direct transmission is not asking you to abandon your life and move to a mountaintop. It is asking you to show up for the life you already have. The cup of coffee you drink every morning contains within it the entire universe of direct experience, if you are willing to pay attention. The warmth of the mug in your hands, the complex aroma rising in the steam, the first sip, slightly bitter, slightly sweet, spreading across your tongue. These are not trivial details. They are the raw material of awakening. They are the places where the finger stops pointing and the moon becomes visible. There is a practice in some Zen communities called tea meditation, in which a group of practitioners share a cup of tea together in complete silence, giving their full attention to the experience, the sound of the water boiling, the color of the tea as it steeps, the warmth of the cup, the taste. It sounds absurdly simple, and it is. But practitioners who engage in this practice regularly report that it transforms not just the experience of drinking tea, but their relationship with every other ordinary activity. Once you have tasted tea with full attention, you begin to notice how rarely you taste anything with full attention. And that noticing, that simple recognition of how often you are absent from your own life, is itself a form of waking up. The same principle applies to walking. In Kinhin, the walking meditation practiced between periods of sitting in a Zen monastery, each step is taken with the same quality of attention that is brought to the breath during Zazen. The foot lifts, the weight shifts, the foot descends. The soul makes contact with the floor. This is not a complicated technique. It is simply the act of walking, stripped of all the mental noise that usually accompanies it, the planning, the rehearsing, the worrying. And when you walk this way, even for a few minutes, the world changes. Or rather, the world does not change at all, but your perception of it shifts, and you see what was always there, but hidden behind the veil of habitual inattention. The remarkable, astonishing fact that you are alive, that you are here, that the ground supports you and the air fills your lungs, and the light falls on everything with equal generosity. This is not mysticism. It is not philosophy. It is the most practical thing in the world. Every therapist, every counselor, Every wise friend has offered some version of the same advice at one time or another. Slow down, pay attention, be present. What Zen adds to this common wisdom is 25 centuries of refined technique and accumulated experience. It offers not just the advice, but the method. Sit down, face the wall, breathe, and discover for yourself what happens when you stop running from the present moment and turn to face it directly. The teachers who have brought this practice to the modern West understood something important. Zen does not belong to any particular culture or era. It is not Japanese. It is not Chinese. It is not Indian. It is human. The practice of sitting still and paying attention is available to anyone, anywhere, at any time, regardless of their religious background, cultural identity, or philosophical commitments. When Shunryu Suzuki arrived in San Francisco in 1959, he was struck not by the difficulty of teaching Zen to Americans, but by the quality of their beginner's mind. They had no preconceptions about what Zen was supposed to be. They came to the cushion with fresh eyes and open hearts. And that freshness, that openness, is itself the beginning of direct transmission. Today, Zen practice centers can be found on every continent. In homes and apartments in cities and suburbs around the world, individuals sit quietly on cushions each morning before the rest of the household wakes, practicing the same basic discipline that Bodhidharma practiced in his cave, that Huineng practiced in the rice-bounding shed, that Dojin practiced at Aiheiji. They do not all wear robes. They do not all chant in Japanese. They do not all follow the same forms, but they all share the same fundamental commitment to sit still, to pay attention, and to discover for themselves what no book, no lecture, no video can provide: the direct experience of being alive. The flower sermon happened, if it happened at all, on a mountaintop in India 2.5 millennia ago. But it is also happening right now. Every time you pause in the middle of a busy day and take one conscious breath, every time you look at a tree and really see it, not the concept tree, but the actual living, breathing presence in front of you. Every time you listen to someone speaking and hear not just their words, but the silence from which the words arise. Every time you set aside your phone, close your laptop, and sit quietly with yourself, asking nothing of the moment except that it be what it already is. In all of these moments, the flower is being held up. The question is, will you smile? Zen does not ask you to believe anything. It does not require you to accept any doctrine, subscribe to any creed, or join any institution. It asks only one thing: look. Look directly at your own experience. Look at the mind that is reading these words right now. Look at the awareness that is hearing these sounds. Look at the space in which all of this is happening. And when you look, really look, with the kind of fierce, gentle, uncompromising attention that Bodhidharma brought to his wall, and Huig brought to his question, and Huineng brought to the Diamond Sutra, and Dojin brought to his cushion, you may find something that has been here all along. Something so simple and so obvious that it has been hiding in plain sight. Something that no amount of words could ever fully describe, but that a single moment of genuine seeing can reveal. That is the transmission. Not a thing passed from one hand to another, not a secret whispered in the dark, but the moment when seeing happens, when the eyes of understanding open, when the flower is held up and the smile breaks through like sunlight after rain. It has been happening for 2,500 years. It is happening right now. And it will go on happening, teacher to student, mind to mind, heart to heart. For as long as there are human beings who are willing to sit still, ask the deepest questions, and discover for themselves what no word can contain. If you found something meaningful in this exploration, if even a single sentence resonated with something you already knew but had not yet put into words, take a moment to subscribe to Boring Zen and tap that like button. Sharing this video with someone who might benefit from it is one of the most generous things you can do. And remember, the next time you feel overwhelmed by the noise of the world, the next time the words pile up and nothing quite makes sense, you can always return to the simplest practice there is. Sit down, breathe, and look directly at what is right in front of you. The flower has already been held up. All that remains is the smile.